It's been over 4 months since Duskhaven shut down, by far my favorite World of Warcraft server ever. It had a lot going for it, and it attracted some very devoted fans during its runtime. At the moment, developers are hard at work creating Duskhaven Reforged, which has the potential to be even better if they manage to keep the spirit and feeling of Duskhaven 1.0 intact. Today I want to bring an ode to Duskhaven, a list of things I particularly enjoyed and which I think contributed greatly to its large fun factor, and which I think should be present in the new incarnation as well. Before we get started, I need to make clear that Duskhaven definitely wasn't perfect, and that there were quite a few issues with everything I'll talk about, in addition to lag, bugs, and so on. There's no need to point all of this out again, I'm fully aware of its flaws, yet in my opinion, the pros heavily outweighed the cons. Let's get into it. Oh, and if you like this kind of content, like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be bringing out tons of guides for Duskhaven Reforged when it finally launches. Duskhaven ran on a Wrath of the Lich King core, but was capped at level 60. This meant, in my opinion, we got the best of both worlds. A Rat core meant that the leveling was faster and the gameplay smoother compared to actual vanilla or classic realms. Pretty much every spec was viable, the talent trees were better, and plenty of quality of life changes were implemented. The LFD tool might not be for you, but you're not forced to use it. If you want to just level the old-fashioned way, you could do that. For people like me, who have done the leveling content before, even the Duskhaven custom stuff, having the option to power level through LFD was really welcome. All of these red core aspects were combined with a level 60 cap, which meant that the continent of Azeroth was the main focus. The faction capitals were always busy, until the last month or so at least. The classic dungeons and raids were endgame content, and there just seemed something right about having level 60 as the cap. Duskhaven had excellent class design, again in my opinion. Not everything worked all the time, but pretty much every spec and every class was viable. Some were better than others at certain tasks. For example, Resto Druids weren't the best in Mythic +8s, but they could still do it, and were great to have in raids. Whichever spec you played, you could usually find a spot in a raid or dungeon, and everything played pretty smoothly and was fun as hell. I've played nearly every class and spec in Duskhaven at endgame, with the exception of Warlock and Paladin, and I really enjoyed them all. This definitely isn't the case with most other versions of World of Warcraft. Sure, the bulk of the class design could be attributed to Blizzard's standard Wrath of the Lich King game, but every single spec in Duskhaven 1.0 received special talents, skills, and little quirks which made them all the more fun to play. Almost without exception, those additions were improvements, and it was clear that the developer knew what classes needed. A few examples here are Arms Warriors getting a mini shockwave built into their overpower to improve their cleave damage, Frost Mages getting Glacial Spike, Ferals getting a guaranteed clear casting proc with their Fairy Fire. They were able to cast Innervate in shapeshift forms. Holy Priests were proccing Light Form upon crit healing. Warlocks were able to summon a Bitlord, and so on. A lot of fun stuff, honestly. I'd also like to mention that compared to Classic, where there is one viable tank and two kinda but not really options, Duskhaven 1.0 featured 7 tanks, with only the Monk being pretty weak. That left 6 actually viable tank specs, which of course made filling groups much easier, especially considering the fact that all Demon Hunters could tank by just switching their stance. Speaking of class design, in Duskhaven 1.0, there were a few custom classes, namely the Demon Hunter, Tinker, Monk, and Bard. I guess you could also count the Shaman, Stonewarden tank spec and Melee Hunter here. All of these were piggybacked upon already existing classes. Demon Hunters were rogues, Thinkers were hunters, monks priests, and bards druids. This came with some issues, mostly to do with talents and abilities, but for the most part I think it worked really well. Personally, I loved that Demon Hunters were rogues who just turned on the Demon Hunter stances. This meant that they retained access to skills like Vanish, Evasion, Blind, Sprint, Stealth, and Cloak of Shadows. As a tank Demon Hunter, some of those were invaluable. You could also easily wipe your threat while you were DPSing, or survive a lot of dangerous stuff and even wipes. I used to sneak to the end of dungeons, turn on the tank stance and just solo the final boss to get the Mythic Plus key. It was really fun, and it's these kind of things that made Duskhaven so great for me. As a monk, you could swap between tanking, DPSing, and even healing during a fight, using the same gear. And if you were tired of playing as a monk, you could just turn off the teachings of the monastery and play as a normal priest. This is something we're losing when Duskhaven Reforged launches, as Demon Hunter and Monk will just be their own class. I can understand why, but it's still sad. Duskhaven 1.0 had a lot of content, and provided enough people were online, there was always something to do. There were normal dungeons to farm for gold, mats, or keys, Mythic Plus dungeons, raids, custom raids, heroic raids, and so on. And for the most part, everything stayed more or less relevant. You could be decked out in Tier 2, but there would still be a reason to go do Molten Core. For example, because bosses dropped a currency you could exchange for tier pieces, which could then be sold. And the custom content was, again for the most part, well done, considering this was a private server. The heroic versions of raids were a good addition, with actual new mechanics and not just a lazy increase in HP and damage, and even custom bosses. My favorite here was Heroic Nefarian, which was a completely different fight. New raids such as the Shara Crater and the Emerald Dream were fun as hell as well, albeit sometimes buggy. I also really enjoyed the Brawlers Guild, which gave some great rewards and provided a decent challenge. Content got added on a regular basis as well. It felt like every other week something new got added. A dungeon, a raid, a system, an event, and so on. Of course, because this went largely untested, there were a lot of issues with it. So the execution wasn't great, but the concept behind it was. Even during leveling, there was a lot of custom stuff added, such as quests, hidden chests which granted experience, buff food and a good item, and so on. Duskhaven Reforged is adding to this, with extra zones and even more custom stuff. This is one aspect of it, which I can't wait to try out. The Mythic Plus system in Duskhaven 1.0 was done well, in my opinion. There had been only 2 seasons of it by the time Duskhaven shut down, and it's fair to say Season 2 went on for too long, but I still enjoyed doing the weekly +8s, or even 2-manning the +4s and some +6s, to gear up my ults. This content provided a great way for beginner characters to start gearing up in +2s and +4s, and gradually work their way up the ladder. Completing all +8s gave you a title, a mount, some gold, and a token to be exchanged for some excellent gear. While a good group of geared players should have no problem breezing through even the +8s, the mechanics were such that wipes were definitely possible, and combined with a time limit, this meant that failure was always an option. It kept you on your toes, and it provided a decent challenge, with worthwhile rewards and plenty of fun. This system is getting revamped in Duskhaven Reforged, with more than just 4 difficulty levels and way more dungeons. This could work out very well, but I'll reserve judgment until I've played it. Duskhaven 1.0 was fully cross-faction. You could talk to, team up with, and do dungeons and raids with the other faction. This was pretty great, making it much easier to fill groups and letting players play the race they want, instead of being shoehorned into whatever was the dominant faction on the server, as is the case on many other realms. As far as I know, this feature will remain in Duskhaven Reforged. And finally, Duskhaven was really alt-friendly. You could level 1 through the LFD system pretty fast, and gearing up was very doable as well, considering the Mythic Plus system and the abundance of raids. There were no stupid borrowed power systems like in retail World of Warcraft, and no barriers to just playing multiple characters. And because they were all so fun, it was very likely you wanted to do just that, because I certainly did. In short, Duskhaven 1.0 was a diamond in the rough. It had so many great features and a lot of potential, which unfortunately got buried under its undeniable problems, most notably the lag, bugs, and untested content. If the developers of Duskhaven Reforged managed to retain most of what I mentioned in this video, while eliminating the bad parts of 1.0, this will be the greatest World of Warcraft private server out there. Nothing would be able to even compare, and even Blizzard's Season of Discovery would fall way short. Anyway, that's about all for now. We're still awaiting the PTR announcement, so it's unlikely we'll see a launch of Duskhaven Reforged this month. Maybe not even in February. See you all in the next video, or on the PTR.